Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Wherever you are in the world, welcome to the Poetry News with Eddie, Squigs, and this week's guest presenter, Mark Fishbein. How's everyone doing today? You good?
Yeah,
Good. Well.
Fantastic. Well, very, very well, thank you. We have lots of news coming up today. That's partly why I'm very well, actually. I love a bit of poetry news. And we start this week with Strange Horizons. Now, what is Strange Horizons? It is an online weekly magazine that publishes all things science fiction, fantasy, speculative, and slipstream, including poetry. And as someone who's a bit of a sci-fi nerd, this is definitely very appealing to me. They have a reading window that opened on the 1st of September and will stay open until the end of 2021. You can send any poem of any length, and if they publish it, they will give you $50. There are a few conditions around exclusivity for 6 months and bits and bobs like that, but, standard for submissions. Quoting from their website, they say, "We value formalism as well as experimentality and are highly receptive to both. Poems must substantiate their forms. A weak concept in rhyme is still a weak concept. Sonnet plus spaceship is not enough." At which point I went, damn, just kidding. But I do thoroughly recommend this. If you love your sci-fi and you love your poetry, there's some good reading on there. If you want fancy entering or just reading the poems, go to strangehorizons.com. So, Squigs, Eddie, how are you? You sci-fi fans? You write sci-fi poetry? Something you fancy a go at?
It is kind of weird, actually, like this mash of poetry and sci-fi and speculative literature. Like when we think of sci-fi and speculative literature and all that, we don't think of poetry. We usually think of fiction or of like prose, pieces of prose. But when you try to merge them together, that should be interesting. I really want to visit the website and check out the poetry there.
Yeah, definitely. I myself am a big Star Trek fan, and I'm working on a compilation of Star Trek poems. Why is everybody laughing? You know it's real. Anyways,
because I am too.
And I am three.
Oh, yeah, Star Trek. All right, so we have Star Trek and poetry. It just seems to go together, poetry and sci-fi. What do you think about that, Mark?
Poetry and sci-fi? Oh, a lot. I mean, sci-fi to me, sci-fi is a relatively new idea. I mean, there was no sci-fi in the 18th century, the 19th century. It just kind of began, and it defines us because everything that sci-fi started talking about, like H.G. Wells in 1903 or something, it's all come true. And they were visionaries. They were so real. Science fiction has become reality to us. And as poets, of course, we're fascinated with sci-fi. It brings out all the metaphors of what future we have. Is it just dystopian or utopian? We'll see.
It's so true, isn't it? And it allows you to be so experimental in your writing. I mean, on the website, I can particularly recommend Ode to Women's Arms and Sci-Fi Television by a poet called Hannah Warren. And, like you say, these concepts have been mixed together before. There's an episode of Star Trek Next Generation where Data writes an ode to his cat. And it's just absolutely amazing. So absolutely. Love the fact that you're into it. Hopefully some of you are as well watching at home. So if you fancy checking that out, go to strangehorizons.com and you have until the end of the year to submit. We will be back right after a word from our sponsors.
Welcome back, everyone, to this episode of the Poetry News. I'm Eddie, and I'm joining you from the beautiful town of Batoon in the north of Lebanon. Today, I'm bringing you a poetry and rap workshop by the Project Destiny of I Am with the topic of renew and release. In this workshop, Moroccan poet and one of the founders of Moroccan Poets, Younes Omari, known for his stage name Otaku Flow, and American rapper Sam the Sentient will provide some tips and pointers on writing and performing poetry and rap. They are going to provide participants with fun and challenging prompts to encourage them to explore their inner thoughts on renewing and releasing the energy that poets have. This workshop will be held on Saturday, September 18 at 6 p.m. GMT. You can sign up and check further details. Everything is in the description to this video. Martin, Squigs, what do you guys think about poetry and rap? Like, how do these things work together in a workshop? What do you guys think?
You know, rap is supposed to be an acronym for rhythm and poetry, so it already works. I think it's just a natural progression, and you dare say even like definitely like a more modern style of poetry. Like rap is everywhere these days, and whose writing is not influenced in some way with that kind of those bars and those kind of rhymes. So it's, I think, a great workshop, and yeah. What do you guys think?
Yeah, well, I had no idea that rap stood for rhythm and poetry. That's really cool. No, I think it's a fabulous idea because, you know, I think there's definitely a prevalence of poets who think they can't do rap or say they wouldn't do it just because they wouldn't do justice to it, because there's been so much amazing rap going right back, you know, as far as the 70s and probably beyond that as well. And, you know, I certainly always have this impression that I could never do it. So something like a workshop like this would really challenge me and shake me out of that. So I'd love to attend. That sounds fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, to me, I mean, you could tell from the color of my hair that rap is relatively, it came a little late in my time. But, you know, you're looking back at it, I mean, from the beats, because I kind of grew up with the beat poetry, and beat poetry was like rap. You know, I mean, it just, you know, it had its myths, you know, with the bongos and the guys, you know, and all that. But it definitely was that type of a form. And then Dylan took over, and I guess some of the stuff he did was so close to being rap, and it was so, you know, just visionary. He ultimately won the Nobel, you know, for it. And then rap evolved, and it became very, very self-absorbed in rhyme. And so there's right now this major conflict between page poetry and people that write this traditional type of poetry and rap. And there really shouldn't be a separation. There really should be a union. And I'm waiting for that rap that works both as rap and page poetry. There are a couple of people out there that are getting into it and making it start, but they're not separate. They're together. They just have to join. And so that's what I'd be looking for to see in a workshop, how we can evolve that.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I remember this workshop one time I attended, and it was a poetry writing workshop, but we did listen to some rap and read some rap verses in order for us to get the idea or the gist. They are technically the same, or two faces of the same coin. All right, up next we are going to go with Mark, but first let's have a break and then we'll continue.
Well, hi, I'm Mark from Mark, the Poet with the Guitar. I live in Washington, D.C., and I was invited here to talk a little bit about the Poetry Academy, part of the Poetry Global Network. My idea is, I felt that, you know, somehow a lot of young poets today, they never had the opportunity to study poetry. They just don't teach it anymore. It's amazing to imagine that in past times, everybody grew up, went to school, learned Scansian. They learned how to tell accents and syllable counts and all the rest of that. It was obviously totally lost. And poetry evolved into a kind of academic crossword puzzle, and everybody got turned off by it. And now they don't even teach it by and large. So here we are on Zoom, which has connected us, and all poets are emerging and exploding all over the place, and they haven't had the opportunity to discuss and learn about poetry. So I thought we'd put up an academy, a very relaxed kind of a place where we'll meet and discuss poetry. And I got all these books that I could recommend for people to get their head into poetry. But the more you learn about poetry, the freer you become, the easier it is to find your voice, the more you realize who you're copying and you don't even know it. There's so much to be learned, and I'd love to be able to be part of exploring that learning with everybody here on Zoom. The first one that we're doing actually is called Performing Poetry on Zoom. Because how do, now that you're on this screen and everybody out there is a little square, how do you connect and get the best of your performance to really connect and get the most out of this medium? Actually, it's never been explored. So I'm doing that on the 26th of this month at 10 a.m. Eastern time. It's a Sunday. And I'm sure we'll give you some information about it. And that's going to be a really exciting group of people. Good Zoom performance, discussions, Q&A, and people performing for a panel and having comments. So we'll see you then, and that's a little bit about why I'm here today. Thanks.
I think that's incredibly interesting, Mark.
It is. The thing is that a lot of poets have shown up and they have started their performance, let's call it career, on Zoom, and I know many people who only have performed on Zoom, who they've never performed in person, and it is interesting. And to go back to the idea of poetry being taught, whether read or whether to write, it is very, it is true. I am a teacher and I teach literature, and I know how little we teach poetry, and I try to incorporate that as much as possible, at least for these students or for anyone to have this basic knowledge or just the ideas of what poetry could be and what it could allow them to do. It is very interesting, and I'm very glad that the Poetry Academy is opening soon.
Oh, absolutely, and exactly the same here. And I would say, Eddie, thank you for teaching that to your students, and also Mark, thank you for setting these up. This is a subject that makes me quite angry, actually. A few years ago, so we have a national curriculum in the UK, like prescribed, the same kind of stuff prescribed nationally. And a few years ago, that was being redone, and poetry was deemed not culturally significant in that adjustment. And that is just, that's to any poet, that's a phrase that just hammers through you, or to any poet, I mean, just the brazen attitude to even call it that, and obviously there was a backlash, but at the same time, it just goes to show, if you're not teaching it, then you're not getting people into it. And it's also about, getting the poetry that's relevant to people. The little poetry I was taught at school had I think we learned something like The Lady of Shalott or something, and it's like, what relevance does that have to a 10-year-old? So I would say thank you for teaching this. It sounds a fabulous idea, and sign me up.
Yeah, they say that language is the way that we frame reality. So poetry is a way for which a reality can be richer. And I'd love to check out this academy there, Mark. Thanks for
Sure. Yeah, we'll have a lot of different types of ideas for poets who just don't know. We'll do one on publishing, just to discuss publishing, because we don't know. We poets are lost in that. And just imagery, different discussions of why sonnets, who knows where we'll go. So I think it's going to be a really good experience for everybody who gets involved in it. Well, thank you. Yeah.
All right. So are we gonna have another short break? Yeah, we'll have another short break, and then I'll be back with some headline news. So see you all in a few minutes. Seconds. Greetings, everyone. Good day, good evening, good morning, wherever you are in the world. I am currently in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada. My name is Squigs, and I will be reporting on some headline news. Actually, this is an interesting article I found from theguardian.com by Alison Flood. Now, I'd like to read for you this piece of ancient Greek text, which goes, "They say what they like. Let them say it. I don't care. Go on. Love me. It does you good." Now, that anonymous text, of course translated, was very popular across the Eastern Roman Empire in the 2nd century, and has been found inscribed in at least 20 gemstones and as a graffito in Cartagena, Spain. Now, after comparing all versions of this text for the first time, classics professor Tim Whitmarsh of the University of Cambridge noticed that it used a different form of meter than usually found in ancient Greek poetry, employing stressed and unstressed syllables. Whitmarsh said that stressed poetry, the ancestor of all modern Western poetry and song, was unknown before the 5th century, and it began to be in use during the Byzantine Christian hymns, or during Byzantine Christian hymns. Before the emergence of stress poetry, poetry was quantitative, based on syllabic length. Whitmarsh believes that this verse, with its 4 lines, 4 syllables, with a strong accent on the first and a weaker on the third, could represent a missing link between the lost world of ancient Mediterranean oral poetry and song and the more modern forms of poetry we know today. In an interview with Professor Whitmarsh, says that poetry was so important, everyone read Homer and all that sort of thing, but we know that spoken language wasn't really appropriate for that kind of poetry. So at some point, people come in with stressed poetry, which is the equivalent of modern poetry. That's the form we use all the time. It's so natural to us now that it feels as if it's universal, but it's not. It actually occurred in Greek culture at a specific moment. See, this poem pushes back the earliest appearance of stress poetry by at least 300 years, and I would invite everyone to check out more information on this on The Guardian, www.theguardian.com. And I'd like to invite my heralds back to have a discussion about the origins of our poetry and history of our poetry. So, everyone, what do you think about the history of poetry as well? How did you start out? What was the defining moment, would you say?
Well, as the eldest, the defining moment for me was just hearing a particular poem that just resonated and just opened up my world. But in just talking about the ancient world, what you're talking about, well, firstly, I think that meter and stanzas poetry did exist in ancient Rome long before this gentleman was saying. There was something called Asclepiadean meter that Horace, I can't remember the word exactly, that Horace and others ascribed to, and they counted the syllables very carefully. And Roman was more triotic. The syllable started on the first accent, as opposed to our language, which is iambic, da 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 da. So there are a lot of different, and it's a big conversation. I think he generalized a little bit out of the range there, because even reading ancient Egyptian poetry that they found, love songs, and they're written with wonderful meters and all that. So I think the whole idea of language evolving its own language of poetry was well known. It was known to Aristotle, who was the poetry defendant in the ancient world. To him, poetry was truth. It was another type of truth. So there's a big subject, but as far as, but I think it has a lot of future discussion. Love to hear your takes. I've gone on enough. Go ahead, somebody take it away. Eddie?
All right. All right.
Take it away.
My introduction to poetry in English actually started with Dylan Thomas's "Do Not Go Gentle into That Good Night," and since then I started reading more of his work, and then I jumped to other capital M modernist poetry, and this is how I started, and then I went and did my degree in literature and so on. However, I do want to talk a bit about Arabic poetry, which is something we learned at school here in Lebanon. Like in grade 10, we took a lot of Arabic poetry because all pre-Islamic and then Islamic poetry, or literature, all was poetry. So before then, like the pre-Islamic poetry was so beautiful. However, when I was younger, when I was like 15 or 16, I didn't appreciate it. And then later on, when I became a university student, and then later I grabbed that book, that grade 10 book, and I started reading it. And it was so beautiful, especially now that I can understand poetry and I can understand how to read poetry. So it is interesting to see how this kind of Mediterranean modern poetry or how it came to be, whether it was Greek or Arabic or anywhere else. It is very interesting. I am very interested in this article.
Martin, how
yeah.
did you start off in poetry, sir?
Well, I'd just say, I mean, the article, it is a fascinating article, isn't it? And you know, it's amazing how deep these poetic roots go. And, you know, I mean, it makes you wonder what other poetry from that, you know, now we've gone back another 300 years, it makes you wonder what other poetry from the 2nd and the 3rd and the 4th century is out there still waiting to be discovered. You know, that's an amazing thing. I would say, so I had, it's hard to know exactly where my introduction was. My introduction to performance poetry was John Cooper Clarke. I saw a documentary about him on the telly, and that really got me into the idea of actually performing it. However, I was already writing poetry before then. Like, I've always written since I was a kid. It was more stories, and there was some point that I can't quite remember where those stories started to become written poems that I'd spend probably more than a decade never actually showing anyone. Then after seeing this documentary, it made me want to get into performance, and I discovered my local open mic scene. So yeah, no one specific introduction really, because I'm not entirely sure. It just sort of happened. What about you, Squigs?
Oh, always had an affinity for poetry, of course, growing up. Just something, just I found naturally beautiful, the way things are written and said. But I think, like my actual introduction to say like performance poetry was watching a video of, if everyone remembers Anish Muscani, he's an American spoken word artist, and he was a big deal back in the day. And during that time, it just his works just made me cry, you know. And I thought, oh, you know, that's cool. I should find if I could do any venues like this, like that have, you know, poetry live, and here we are, all these years later. Pretty much, right? Poetry happens. Let's get that on a t-shirt. All right, so I think we're going to close out the show for this episode for this week. Martin, do you had something to say about other shows for the great PGN network here?
Oh, absolutely, yes. So we have a whole plethora of poetry here on PGN. We have every week, we have the Poets Lighthouse coming out once a week. We have the Poets React that comes out twice a week. We have, obviously, the Poetry News. We have new shows starting. We have different content on our Instagram. There's absolutely loads. I think that the best way to keep in touch with it all is just to follow all of our social media channels, and pretty much every day you'll see something new.
Yes, please make sure that you subscribe and like this video. Comment down below anything you want, what you want us to talk about, any workshop ideas, what are your opinions on the topics we discussed today. Follow us on Instagram at the PGN Official. Check us out on Facebook. If you want to tell us anything, send us an email on poetryglobalnetwork@gmail.com. Thank you, Squigs. Thank you, Martin. Thank you, our guest herald, Mark. And we will see you all next week.